All right, welcome. I am Dr. Anna Smith, and I am excited to welcome you to our final session for the fall of the Creatively Critical Tech Research Design Practice Speaker Series. I have some introductory remarks, and while I make them, I welcome all of those of you who are joining today to introduce yourselves in the chat. So you find the chat at the bottom of the screen, it says chat, and then once you get there, it'll be over on the right side of your screen, and there will be a little radial dial between panelists, and then you can change that to everyone. So go ahead and click everyone. Tell us who you are, where you're joining us from, what you do, and we're going to keep the chat open as much as we can to have a dialogic experience. And please respect that and keep your comments productive. So the Creatively Critical Tech series comes to us from the Education Now Lab at Illinois State University in the School of Teaching and Learning. The Education Now Lab is a community-engaged research practice lab that works with and produces a range of critical, interdisciplinary, public, academic, and new media scholarship with and alongside community members as we labor towards more just educational futures. And we're hosting this series as part of a course called Critical Perspectives on Technology and Education. And we're recording and sharing those resources from each of the talks online at the EDU Now Lab space, which I'll share the URL to, and it's the site you're seeing here. You can currently go there and see the recordings from our previous sessions if you scroll down. And we'd like to thank Fikayo Olutomowa for her work in managing our lab's online presence and accessibility. So thank you, Fikayo. We'd also like to welcome and thank our ASL interpreter tonight, Shelley Zimmerman. Thank you, Shelley. We also are joining, so some of our guests in the webinar also coming from practicing teachers who are taking a course on e-learning ecologies and thinking about connected learning across those spaces. So welcome to them too. They could be there in the chat. The series is co-sponsored by the ISU Office of Research and Graduate Studies in the College of Education, and we thank them for their generous support. And in that, we recognize and we're working to make meaningful that Illinois State University is built on the lands and waters of multiple Indigenous nations who were forcibly removed, including the Illini, Peoria, and the Miami, and later, due to colonial encroachment and displacement, to the Fox, Potawatomi, Sauk, Shawnee, Winnebago, Iowa, Mascouten, Piankashaw, Wea, and Kickapoo nations. We also honor the Indigenous people who have been excluded due to historical erasure and inaccuracy. And we're currently seeing the sustained struggles and atrocities happening regarding peoples and lands and in the current horrific current events. And in our last session too, I hoped that what we could do is dedicate the insights and the energies that we draw together toward action that we can use to move toward better futures. So joining us tonight to talk about the ways that we can work together to move toward those futures are Dr. Phil Nichols, who is an associate professor of literacy education at Baylor University. His research focus is on how science and technology condition the way that we practice, teach, and talk about literacy, and the implications for education, equitable public education. Dr. Nichols is currently working on several projects. First, he examines the concept of innovation and how it gets immobilized in public school reform and the competing interests and imperatives that drive these efforts. This is the focus of his most recent book and for our conversation today as well. So his book is Building the Innovation School, Infrastructures for Equity in Today's Classrooms. And he's also doing work where he explores emerging platform architectures, meaning the hardware and the software and the algorithms that all work together, and their uneven impacts on literacy education and civic learning. And last, he's also studying the political history of media education, that concept of media education, and its work in bridging Cold War social science aesthetics and English literacy pedagogy. And that was the focus of his 2021 NAED Spencer postdoctoral fellowship. which is quite a laudable fellowship to get. So congratulations on that from a few years ago. We're also joined with Mr. Samuel Reed, who is a founding U School educator and has been teaching students to read, write, and make sense of the world for over 19 years. Reed's passion includes arts in education, media literacy, and understanding youth culture. He blogs for the Philadelphia Public School Notebook, and his work has been published in the University of Pennsylvania, Perspective of Urban Education. Most recently, he's published an article called Connected Learning and the Rules of Engagement for Heinemann's Digital Campus. And Reed attended Philadelphia public schools and has been fortunate to live and travel abroad in many places, as Botswana, Kenya, and Russia. He received his BA in computer science from the Cheney State University of Pennsylvania and an MBA from Clark Atlanta University and a master's in education from Temple University. So I'd like to welcome both of them and turn our time over to them now. Let me do a little bit of repinning here.
Thank you, Anna. So yeah, I know I'm really excited for the opportunity to share some of this work with you today, both because it's stuff that I've been thinking about for a long time, but also because it's a chance to present with Sam. We have presented together many times, but it's been a few years since we've been able to, and so this was a really welcome opportunity for us to be able to reconnect and to sort of think through, in some ways, not just the work that we've done together, but also some of the kinds of innovations that have gone on since then as well. So for anyone who has who's had a chance to read the book that sort of came out of some of this work, the Building the Innovation School book, hopefully this presentation maybe touches on both some things that weren't in the book, but that maybe were historical historical sort of foundations within the school district that sort of led up to the sort of innovation work that gets documented in the book, and then also some of the really powerful work that Sam has continued to do since our partnership formally ended anyway. So thank you just for being able to have us here.
Yeah, now I'll echo those thanks as well, folks. I'm really excited to be here. And I was telling Phil as we were preparing to land here that this presentation, you're going to see, you may see me reacting in visceral ways in some of the things that we're going to be sharing, because we're going to be talking about the work that, the research of the work in my school, the research of previous work in the school where I was formerly at that was shuttered, and the research of the school where my sister attended, which was doing innovative things. And in retrospect, even in my own introspection, I'm like, I was looking at Phil's work around the work where he's going to talk about. I'm sorry, I hope I'm not stealing any thunder. It's like, it's the cycle. It's going to be really interesting to see how the cycle happens. So I'm excited. And again, you will be seeing me having some visceral responses. I'm just giving folks a warning.
Yeah, and I think to Sam's point, I mean, the presentation was sharing innovation from below, building infrastructures for transformative education. One of the sort of points that hopefully comes through is that innovation as a concept that maybe sort of floats freely sometimes or gets sort of thrown around a lot has these kind of visceral entanglements with real people and real lives and things like that. And I think that's a big point of our work together, and hopefully something that comes through in this presentation. So I won't belabor this too much because Anna already gave a pretty extensive overview of sort of who we are. But just as some background, I was also a high school, middle school, and high school English teacher prior to coming to graduate work and doctoral study. And I also, in addition to being being trained in literacy studies, I was also trained in history and sociology of science and technology. And so that's something that sort of informs some of how I come to think about some of this work. Um, I don't always, I do write for history journals and things like that, but that those parts of my work often are sort of slower burns and they don't come out as frequently. But that historical perspective informs a lot of work that I do, including this study. And so we'll see a little bit of that in here. So I just say that as a little background. And Sam, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Yeah, I'll add my AKAs. Actually, folks, my students call me Reed, and so I kind of go with that moniker now. You see, I kind of lead with my last name instead of my first name, but I'm also AKA the teacherpreneur, right? And that comes really honestly because before being an educator, I was an entrepreneur. Prior to that, I served in the Peace Corps. I got my MBA, and I didn't want to do the corporate route, so I wanted to go in business for myself out of graduate school, but I didn't have enough capital, real capital or social capital. So I decided to go in the Peace Corps and incubate, and I actually started a tech company in Botswana. My business went bankrupt eventually after 5 years, going almost hit the fifth year. And then when I came back to Philadelphia, I decided to become an educator. And then after I joined, I belonged to amazing networks such as the Philadelphia Writing Project, which is part of the National Writing Project. Um, I you know, transformed into this teacherpreneur. So I just wanted to kind of situate that positionality. I'm an educator and I'm a hustler, and I'm good at both of them. And I'm blessed.
He is. Yeah, you will see that. So just a little bit of maybe context for our collaboration. So Sam and I came to work together partly out of a sort of confluence of events in around the time when I was in graduate school and when Sam was teaching in Philadelphia. But in sort of 2012, 2013, it was a pretty contentious time in Philly school politics. There, along with some other districts around the country. Um, there were a lot of different sort of factors that contributed to the shuttering of about 30 public neighborhood schools in Philadelphia, and that led to a lot of outcry from teachers, from parents, and frustrations just within the community in general, and sort of demands for to sort of say like, well, what happens as a result of that? If you shutter all of your neighborhood schools, students are going to be sort of sent to other places. There's going to be overcrowded classrooms. Like what is the district doing sort of in place of this? And so one of the sort of strategies that the district sort of took on at this time was something that local journalists termed the innovation gamble. Was one of the sort of offerings was it wasn't replacing all 30 of these schools, but it was going to begin to sort of open some new innovative programs throughout the district, including opening a handful of new innovative high schools within the district. And so one of those schools was the school, the U School, which Sam was a founding teacher at, as was said. And early on, actually, before the school had a building, before it even started, I was brought in. At that time, I was a doctoral student and working with Amy Stornaiolo, and she had set up a partnership with the school's founding principal. And we got an agreement from the district to sort of allow us to kind of study and sort of partner with the school over its first few years to sort of look at how these innovative initiatives sort of work on the ground. And so my responsibility was sort of doing the day-to-day kind of like managing of that partnership. So for 3 years or so, I was in meetings and at the school each week and in classrooms and staying after school and sitting in on summer lesson planning and things like that. Um, and so that was really I had met Sam before then through different writing project things, but that was really where we got time to sort of I spent a lot of time in Sam's classroom and
And
seeing him
Phil,
teach. Yeah. Sam.
So if you don't mind, can you go back to that previous slide? Because this is where I'm going to show the visceral impact, right?
Yes.
So this previous slide here, folks, is the school where I taught that was shuttered. Where when I wrote an article for the Education Journal at the University of Penn, I wrote an article about becoming an activist, an accidental teacher activist, partly because we had to wage a campaign to try to keep our school open. And one of the big drivers was like, allow us to reimagine and innovate our school instead of shuttering it. But the district wasn't listening to us. They moved to bring in another school that already had cachet, and they formed a campus at our school, while we actually didn't get shuttered because there was a our campaign was partly successful, but it just prolonged the inevitable. Eventually, we did get shuttered, and then so I was left at this juncture where I could have became a teacher at this newly innovative school, but I didn't feel right staying at a school that was taking over, where they could have let us do the thing that they were actually doing. And so then at that time, the founding principal of the U School was actually interviewing me and interviewing other students about like envisioning this new school model. And that's how I got to the U School. And I wanted to give that context.
Yeah, well, and I think that's helpful because it's sort of in the midst of that, and I think to your point, Sam, I think one of the things that um, I sort of became interested in during this time was just sort of this term innovation, right? That's getting sort of thrown around, and I think to Sam's point, there's teachers who are trying to do or advocate for their own kind of innovations, and then sort of district models of innovation that were sort of being pushed through, and then new innovation models that were being introduced. Um, and so for me, I sort of became interested in sort of how this word was sort of being used to sort of do different kinds of things, and by different kinds of people to do different kinds of things. Um, and um, and so the concept of innovation, it's sort of like one of those things that shows up in education. As I said earlier, it sort of floats freely a little bit. It gets um, it gets invoked a lot, not always with a lot of precision. Um, a lot of times innovation sort of can get, we attach it to things that we like, and we like withhold it from things that we don't. Um, and so it's easy to sort of overlook it or to sort of ignore it. And so for me, over time, I came to sort of think about like what would it look like to sort of follow this term, and to sort of see what kinds of things get attached to it, and what kind of work do those things do. And so the sort of historian in me um, was particularly interested in thinking about how that's maybe also changed over time. So this isn't a scientific thing or anything, but just a basic sort of Google Ngram search. You can see this term innovation has sort of seen a pretty steady kind of incline. It hasn't had like a stable meaning. There have been times in history where innovation has been a bad thing. It's a sort of preoccupation with newness and change, and so it's like a way of forgoing tradition in some way. But more recently, it's been mostly a sort of positive term. But also the term, as it gets sort of taken up in education, has also had these kind of ebbs and flows. And I became interested in just the fact that there was sort of this uptick in talk about innovation in the 1960s, 1970s, and then this sort of dip, and then we can sort of see it sort of coming up again. And so that had led me to do some research into the sort of historical uses of this term in Philadelphia in particular. And one of the things that I was really interested to find, and through a lot of archival research, was able to sort of piece together this Office of Innovative Programs, which opened in the district in the 1960s, 1967. Um, and so sort of I at the same time that I was doing work in this this contemporary innovation school, I was also spending time in archives, and Temple's urban archives, like looking at the sort of historical uses of it. And so my sort of thinking about it, I think, developed sort of in tandem of thinking about it as both a historical thing, but that continues to sort of have purchase in the present, and maybe to mean slightly different things, and that sort of materializes differently. And so that sort of through some of that work, it led me to sort of thinking about, as a kind of an analytical approach, or thinking about sort of like research methods of trying to take seriously this idea of innovation. That's where this concept of, or the language of innovation from below started to emerge. And the idea here is that it's focused less on sort of what innovation is, than sort of looking at what is innovation doing in different contexts, different times, different places. And sort of true to some of my like history of science kind of work, I drew a lot of inspiration on this from historians who've studied kind of concepts or ideas in use or in practice, and also things like infrastructure studies, which sort of look at what are the sort of underlying histories, resources, materials that sort of uphold particular terms and meanings. And then I think this other piece is also important. It's not just what innovation does, but also for whom. The fact that a term like this, just like other, sort of work like history from below or science from below, has historically been attentive to whose perspectives on history or science or innovation get heard and not heard. I wanted to sort of understand which versions of innovation sort of get prioritized, and what are the impacts of those things. And so that sort of drove me, I didn't start there, but that through some of this work, this kind of crystallized as sort of what the sort of the framing I came to think about it through was. And I'd say,
Yeah, I'll just,
yeah,
sorry,
please.
I'm gonna interject and just bring in the visceral fact as well. Here, I am an educator at my previous school, where again, in some cases, I would get the pejorative, like, "You're an innovative teacher, Sam. You know how to find the cracks in, uh, you know." And part of the thing is also being a part of the National Writing Project, where we kind of learn how to do creative compliance, and we become expert at creatively complying because they're mandates that we have. But then they're like, "Oh well, Sam, he's going to figure out a way to do it, but then do it in a different kind of way." But then the principal might worry because I'm not exactly following, you know, the exact prescription. But I wasn't worrying about that because, first of all, I'm focused on kids, what impact my work is going to have on kids, focus on ways to connect and engage with them. And again, I had some basis of research and foundation to back up what I was doing. So I wasn't really afraid. And so I don't know. That's why, like, when I saw Phil like highlight the importance of this word innovation, I was like, wow, this is really important. So I just wanted to again give that context about the way that word innovation plays out, even for practitioners, where sometimes it's used in a constructive way, but sometimes it also can be used in I don't know if I say more or less pejorative way.
Yeah, no, I think that's super important. Um, and yeah, and I think sort of related to this, I mean, not taking for granted this sort of meaning of innovation, and this, approach this idea of innovation from below. I think like, one of the things that I tried to highlight in the book, and that I think, I mean, I think one of the things I learned from working with Sam is that, this kind of approach to thinking about innovation in use and sort of on the ground, it can be an analytical orientation, right? It can be a way to look at sort of what is trafficking in innovation, or what's being called innovative, but it can also be an affirmative practice. So if we think about innovation, we don't take for granted that, the sort of things that are being called innovative are innovative. And instead we start from this perspective of what is innovation doing for whom. Then that can be a way that we actually like design innovations in practice and in classrooms and things like that. So it can be both a sort of a critical lens, and it can also be a way that we design things differently. And so in some ways, we're going to sort of, in the rest of this presentation, sort of talk a little bit about both of those. So I'm going to share a little bit about the sort of analytical orientation. I'm particularly focused on the sort of longer history of innovation in Philadelphia. And then we'll sort of pivot to talking about some of the sort of innovating in practice, or as an affirmative practice, innovating from below. So I'm not going to like totally belabor the history, but just as a little bit of context, that the Office of Innovative Programs, or the sort of history of innovation in Philadelphia, it sort of began under similar kinds of circumstances as some of the contemporary innovation stuff. There was also a lot of contention. There's also a number of community protests, things like that. Also about things like overcrowding, but it was also heavily motivated by the sort of racial politics of the city as well. So in 1967, shortly after Mark Shedd became the superintendent, he was sort of supposed to be responsible for kind of integrating Philadelphia public schools. Just a few months after he took office, there's a massive, famous student walkout that occurred, and where students were protesting for Black history courses, for other culturally responsive policies, to have smaller class sizes, the sort of normal things that people continue to sort of advocate for in the present. And so Mark Shedd, as a sort of new superintendent, is sort of recognizing that there's also a kind of like moment of crisis, and also somewhat similarly found himself in a position where innovation became a kind of useful lever for addressing some of those things. In 1967, he was approached by an organization funded by the Department of Labor, and this is part of the sort of a lot of the like national defense education funding, and subsequent sort of like follow-up sources of funding, to develop a new innovation school that could be part of this large nationwide sort of innovation network. It was a cooperative program for educational innovation called ES70. It's going to be this sort of model school system for the 1970s, but it came attached with it a bunch of money. And so for a district that is under-resourced in terms of space, they hadn't built any new schools in a couple of decades at this point, all of a sudden innovation became a way that you could get some funding to develop new schools. And so Mark Shedd didn't stop there. He used this school because it would have to be developed and opened sort of many years later. And so, I mean, it opened ultimately in 1971. But in those sort of intermediary years, he started to develop a bunch of other innovative programs that could sort of be housed under the auspices of an innovative program office. And so the main school that was being built was what will become University City High School, which I wrote about a little bit about this in a short magazine article, if anyone's interested. I'm not going to talk about it very much right now, but in Logic magazine. But at the same time that Shedd is sort of at work and sort of setting the wheels in motion for developing this school, it's also setting up a bunch of schools within schools, schools without walls, open classrooms, storefront schools, community schools, these little sort of like micro level experimental kind of places where innovative things could be sort of tested out and tried out. The School Without Walls is maybe the most famous example of this. The Parkway Program is what it was called. In 1970, Time magazine referred to it as the most interesting high school in America, because it basically, there was no school building, as the name sounds like, and students met in different community buildings for their different classes. So you take your civics classes in like a courthouse or something like that. So all of these kinds of experiments and innovation are going on. And so one of these kinds of schools that emerged from this point, around this time where there are these kind of protests, a woman named Novella Williams, who was the head of Citizens for Progress, which is a West Philadelphia community activist organization. She staged a series of protests on Penn's campus in West Philly, and basically said that because Penn had been sort of encroaching on the predominantly Black neighborhoods in West Philadelphia for as long as it had been, the university should be basically providing the infrastructure or space for there to be a new school to prevent the sort of overcrowded West Philadelphia high school from continuing to be not really ideal for learning. And so in the midst of this, the University of Pennsylvania went to Mark Shedd and the school district to have this innovative programs office, and they agreed that they would open a new innovative school that could sort of be a place to sort of offload some of the students who were crowded into West Philadelphia High into a sort of annex school called the West Philadelphia Community Free School. And so the sort of conditions for this were that one of the University of Pennsylvania professors, Asa Erickson, would sort of get to be the sort of the lead sort of designer of sort of the model for what this school would look like, this community school. And so she had a very specific kind of vision for this. So where Novella Williams is sort of interested in a community-controlled school, she's interested in sort of Black self-determination in education in West Philadelphia. Asa Erickson's is interested in some of these sort of experimental progressive pedagogies of the time, things like individualized curricula, non-graded classrooms. She's a big proponent of having scattered schools. She says, like, one of the problems with schools that we have right now is that they're these big comprehensive high schools. We should be having dozens and dozens and dozens of schools all around the city that people can choose from. You can think of this as a sort of like proto school choice movement, but maybe tied to some more sort of like experiential pedagogies than just just like pure market incentives or something like that. But she has this vision for sort of humanizing education. And so the school was originally, it was gonna be this annex school from West Philadelphia, which is pictured on the left, and it was gonna meet in a kind of a row home that would then be divided up into different classrooms, and there'd be sort of common spaces and recreation spaces, and students would have free time throughout the day. And so this is the sort of model for it. But unfortunately, before the school opened, the building had to be renovated because it wasn't sort of up to code, so to speak. And so the students ended up having to meet in a like an abandoned storefront, basically, that was on Penn's campus. So Penn made that available to the school. And so you have this combination of factors, though. You have students who, some of whom have opted to go there, have chosen to go to this school. Other students who, because the principal of West Philadelphia realized that with this annex school, you could sort of offload students who are maybe like disciplinary problems, and you could say, like, this school isn't a good fit. Maybe you should try this innovation school. And then also the fact that you have these kind of like open recreation periods and not really compulsory attendance. The idea was that if you create this kind of familial environment, that students would choose to show up to class. And so a lot of students didn't choose to show up to class. And so, and because it's meeting in this storefront, you have a very like public sort of face where people are walking by and they're seeing a lot of students just kind of like hanging out, playing ping pong, things like that. And so it creates this kind of tension where on the one hand, you have, for the community board, who's largely Black residents of West Philadelphia who had advocated for this school, Novella Williams is the head of the board. She is fearing that this is basically like undercutting the sort of the governance of this school board and the authority of the Black community in West Philadelphia who has fought for this school, because people are saying students aren't actually doing anything or learning. And so there's a bunch of these kind of documented sort of back and forths where there's pretty contentious arguments where Novella Williams in this report to the school district says Novella Williams has a more conservative or at least cautious attitude toward innovation or freedom compared to what Asa Erickson had advocated for. And of course, Novella Williams is saying, we feel that we know our people and our kids. And she goes on to say that she thinks that the teachers are trying too much to be like buddies to the students to actually like teach them anything. So
And I'll interject.
yeah,
I'll interject here as well. So my elder sister, went to the West Philadelphia Free School, and I was still in junior high school at the time. But I thought it was like a hippie school, but it was kind of cool at the same time. But again, fast forward, I'm now teaching at the youth school, and I'm looking at what's happening at the youth school in terms of some of our tensions around being an innovative school, and particularly Phil's article that he published, like hit it like the nail on the head. Like a lot of the tensions around giving agency, but then how do you balance giving agency with setting structure at the same time? And so these are some of the tensions that you have to figure out when you're trying to be innovative. And so my sister, she ended up she thrived at the school, but at the same time, if she probably would have went to the West Philadelphia High School with more infrastructure around, particularly around post-secondary, because she didn't end up going to college. And it might have been because this like two free nature of free school. Um, she didn't go to college, but I think she might have went to college if she would have had like the counseling infrastructure that kind of wasn't there at the West Philadelphia Free School. Again, I just wanted to give context of the visceral
yeah.
context of reading Phil's work takes me places. Again, the same thing with his book, which he'll talk about as well. Um,
Well,
this is all visceral for me.
yeah. Well, and I think too, I mean, it also speaks to the fact that I think these schools often worked for some students really well, and then for others not so much. And I
Oh, and
think
the other thing I wanted to advise folks, if you wanted to get like a bit more context around what was happening in Philly at the time, another scholar, he wrote a book that kind of gives a trajectory of what happened with black education and black educators. It's Dr. Kamika Royal, uh, not paid for us, and I did a review of her book. I get fascinated when scholars write a book that is like really meaningful, and so I'll read it and I'll do a review. And so I did a review for that book as well, and it parallels a lot of the things that he's talking about in terms of like Miss Williams and other folks that are like pushing for uh, you know enfranchisement for Black students and Black educators. So yeah, you can check out Dr. Kamika World's book, Not Paid For.
yeah, I recommend that as well. So just to sort of uh, yeah, because I want to make sure we have time to talk about the sort of like affirmative side of this. But I think one of the things that this sort of highlights, right, is that um, in this historical context, we can see this kind of mismatch of different ways that this idea of innovation sort of being like leveraged, right? You have the principal of West Philadelphia High School sort of seeing innovation as a way to sort of offload students by reassigning them there as opposed to being in the building. The district can use this concept of innovation as a way of securing funding and to sort of calm dissent. The University of Pennsylvania can also calm dissent and can also sort of advocate for a kind of research into humanizing pedagogy. The local community in West Philadelphia is um, is not necessarily interested in the sort of like innovativeness per se, but if innovation is a term that you can sort of leverage to get community governance of a school and to encourage Black self-determination in West Philadelphia education, then like they're like Novella Williams specifically is sort of willing to use it. And she sort of talks about that. Um, this is all based on some oral history research that I did around this West Philadelphia Free School, and then also I think teachers are sort of in the middle of this, right? You have it's mostly white teachers teaching at the school who are very much in line with this sort of vision of humanizing education, but you also have a number of Black teachers who are residents in West Philadelphia who are close with members of this community board who also care about the community governance piece, and so reconciling these tensions. where innovation's sort of this like concept that everyone's sort of like fighting over, it puts pressure on certain people to sort of reconcile that tension more than others. And I think that's a key thing here, is like the district, Penn, they're sort of insulated from having to like figure out what innovation sort of should work or not. But people like the teachers are sort of put in this position where sometimes you are making decisions where your professional allegiance to the school, to your students, and to your like to members of the community are sort of put in tension in some way. And so I mention this because this is also something, a sort of parallel thing that I write about in the book, in the contemporary sense, where from very early on, visiting, I think one of the first meetings of all the teachers together at the district office, is a series of sort of people coming through, funders and district administrators and then school leaders, and everybody's sort of like saying the school's going to do this, the school's going to do this. This is going to be one of the things that's innovative. And one of the things that I noticed was that um, there were some like mismatches in sort of what was sort of getting couched as innovative. So within the district, there was a lot of focus on how there's going to be this sort of technological integration, um, and also that this technological integration was going to bolster specifically like content area learning, that was going to lead to these kinds of improvements in test scores. It's going to like ameliorate all of these problems that the other schools that were shuttered had. That this is what this school is going to do. But when I heard people like Sam and other teachers talking, it wasn't that they weren't interested in those things. I think Sam would say this too. You can certainly jump in, Sam. But I heard a lot of things about how do we promote social justice? How do we invite students to sort of think about their communities, think about problems in their communities? How do we create space for them to be autonomous, to learn, to be self-directed learners, and to create spaces for them to be able to do that? And things like entrepreneurship, for them to be able to like have ideas and to sort of follow them through. And so kind of lining those things up, then you can begin to see where there's enough overlap that when we're talking about innovation at the district or among teachers, there's some common ground there. But also I think like the kinds of things that some of those different players sort of have in mind are different. And one of the results of that is that similarly, people at the district level don't have to reconcile that tension, but it falls on teachers, right, to say, if this is the vision that we have to also accommodate these other kinds of demands or pressures that are sort of being put on us. And so I think
Yeah,
that's the
can I speak to when we move as you move into the affirmative practice, the other thing that kind of the acts that I had around the district actually formed an innovation network, right? And the prototype of this network was the school that had a social cachet, had resources because it had families and all of this nature, and we would get compared to this school, which kind of gave us a chip on our shoulder all the time because people were like, oh, you're trying to be like such and such school, which was like the gold standard of innovation in our district. And I'm like, no, we're not trying to be like such and such. Number one, we don't serve the same families, the same kids, the same community. We're not trying to be like that. We're also doing competency based learning, which is different than project based learning, right? And so, like, they wouldn't understand the nuances, but they were always wanting to compare us to this school, which had this social cachet. It had, um, they had a waiting list where kids were clamoring to get inside our school, and we were literally like a school of we're open enrollment, uh, a school of last resort for some kids, to be honest, right? And so it does have a different play, and I just wanted to give that context.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I think it's one of the things that made the school stand apart, I think. So yeah, and so that's a sort of perspective on the sort of innovating from below, like analytically, of sort of how you can sort of look at what sort of how innovation is being used to do different kinds of things. But I also wanted to be able to talk about the affirmative sort of side of thinking about, so how we innovate from below, how we approach innovation, where rather than taking innovations that are sort of um, I don't know, dropped it down from the sky, to instead ask, what are the sort of values that we have, what are our commitments, and how do we pursue forms of innovation that center those things. And so in the book, I talk about one of the examples of this, and there's a chapter that sort of focuses on the literacy lab, which kind of emerged out of a bunch of needs. At the same time that all of these other innovative things are sort of going on, some that are sort of teacher driven, some that are coming from the district. There's also just, there was a real need in some cases for like quiet spaces for students to work, to get support on work and things like that. And so through some of our partnership work, we worked with Sam and with some of the students to design in one of the sort of, actually it didn't even begin in its own separate room. It was part of Sam's classroom. We put up some bookshelves to sort of block out part of it into its own separate space. But a little what became known as the literacy lab. And students were involved in everything from designing it to building it and things like that. And then also one of the things that I talk about in the book is that space also evolved with the needs. So like in that first year, it was about having a quiet space where students could work or get help. But over time, it became a performance space. It became a meeting space. Clubs met there. Eventually, a
maker space.
Yeah, and a student-run tutoring space after a while, where students did sort of peer coaching, sort of out of this space. So if students came in who wanted support, they could meet with a peer tutor. So it evolved a lot. And so in the book, I stress a couple of things that I noticed as patterns for some of these kinds of things, that where there were innovations that sort of came not from sort of things that there wasn't a model for this, right? Like this is something that emerged out of the school. There, if it wasn't just a makerspace, it wasn't just a performance space. It was some hybrid of those things because it came out of those needs. And so in the book, I talk about, starting with everyday practice and looking for the emergent inventions that are sort of already happening, and what are ways that you can then support those things by aligning them with values aligned research. So not just the research that says this is what everybody else is implementing, so you need to do that too, but what are the things that are aligned with those sort of like foundational commitments that you have? And then how do you create infrastructure so that that innovation stays and can remain in some way? And so I mention all of that, but I also think it's important to note that like where the book ends was, I mean, I was involved with the school for 3.5 years, but the school has continued to evolve and innovate since then, and Sam has continued to innovate since then. And so I also wanted to make sure we had some time to look at some of the other ways that he's been doing innovative stuff since that book ended, which I think are examples of this kind of innovating from below. So Sam, I don't know if you want to share some of that.
Yeah, so just to give folks a heads up, if you kind of want to see or get a sense of my practice, where I call it an intersection of innovation, education, and hustle, I blog on Medium, and so you can follow my blogs where I talk about the intersection of innovation. Like we recently started using Chat GPT in our classrooms, but also for our entrepreneurial projects, right? And so you can follow that. You could go to the next slide. And so one cool thing that came out of our recent work is we started a urban agriculture program. And so in our early days, we had these maker spaces that were like fun, but fun for to end where. And so recently we started urban agricultural career technical education program. We call it AFNA. And through the AFNA program, we brought in an expert who worked in Penn State with urban gardening and community gardening and agriculture extension with green technology and the like. And so I'm able to, I talked about me being my positionality as a teachpreneur. And again, I primarily teach humanities subject matter, right? I do also teach like a math and personal finance course, but I'm able to integrate and collaborate with the urban agriculture teacher to start these sustainable side hustle uh, programs that are part of the, the the course, but also external of the course, right? You could go to the next stop. And what we're doing is we're merging urban agriculture with STEM, and so we're learning about food, we're learning about natural resources, and then they're connecting it with careers. And they do it. It's a 1 year intensive that happens in the senior year, but we give students experiences through our summer programs and uh, out of school programs where they get exposure into these opportunities with the urban agriculture program along with the sustainable side hustle work. Right? You can go to the next slide. And it's this these are some examples of like products that they're taking to the market where they're learning how to create products and then sell them. And I'm working with students around that. I can go to the next slide. And it's been really been really cool. Like Phil, he probably didn't even know that we were doing this, right? And this is just like the extension of us having part of like we have to pivot so that we make ourselves um sustainable, right? Because how do you like create a worth or value for uh uh, particularly again when you don't have the social cachet of some of the where some of the schools that are perceived in the innovation network to have, like we don't have that, so we need a way to make ourselves sustainable. And this program has been one of our recent innovations, if you will. And the other cool thing is that I do this work. I don't do this work alone. And that's the thing with innovation. You don't, even though people might call me like an innovative teacher, like you don't do this work alone. You do it alongside your students, your other educators, and then you have to do a lot of collaboration with partners and doing grants and all of the things that people might not see as like traditional being a traditional teacher.
And I think, and we were talking about this a little bit before, but I think that it's also an example of like the um, it's another example of the kinds of things that like fall to teachers to have to do. I mean, Sam is remarkable in the fact that he knows how to sort of go after these grants and to get some of these supports in place. Um, but it means that like to do some of that kind of work, if you don't have that skill set, if you don't have that experience, it's like tough to do it. So I think it also speaks um, to truly make some of this stuff sustainable at a systemic level. I think requires some of these larger
Like,
kinds of commitments
and,
of.
and you know what, Phil, at my previous school, I had to kind of do this under the radar. I had to hide, I had to hide. I would get grants and get media coverage, and they would like partly like, how did this happen? And I would play dumb sometimes, like, oh, I don't know, it was a luck. No, I mean, I knew how to. I was in business before. I know how to write a press release. I know how to work the media. I know how to write a proposal. Like I was doing all that stuff, but I couldn't be out with that at certain spaces because, again, innovation in those spaces is kind of pejorative. Like, what are you doing? Like, you making it work? You making it bad for us, Sam? Like, chill. Like, take it easy. But now I'm at a school that at least my principal was like, "Oh, go for it. But you got an opportunity. Oh, go." He doesn't stand in my way. He encourages, he supports it, and so you need the right space to kind of do this work as well. And like part of it, like the affordance is like, how do you create these spaces that allow innovation for the ground up? Because if you don't create the right space, it's not gonna work.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's well said. Yeah, just I think maybe to sort of close out, and maybe, and yeah, would love to chat more, and if there are questions or things, but I think just a couple of points, like I think this idea of innovation, or thinking about innovation from below, I think two things that hopefully some of this already shared sort of points toward is that this can sort of tune our attention to the competing interests, imperatives that underwrite different conceptions of innovation, and the implications for equitable teaching and learning. And that's that sort of analytical side, right? It's an analytical approach for thinking about innovation. But then it can also be a way of orienting practice. And I think going back to what Sam's point, like, what are the infrastructures that are necessary to sustain those kind of values aligned innovations? And I think a lot of times, um, particularly, yeah, in districts and sometimes even at a school level, there's the desire for the immediate payoff of this innovation or that innovation, the silver bullet or something like that. But the sort of the commitment to the sort of sometimes like boring, mundane kind of stuff. But that like is what is required to like really uphold stuff and to allow students and teachers to thrive, isn't what gets sort of couched as innovation. And so I think the more we can sort of recognize those kinds of things as being integral to innovation, it probably would protect us, or protect us educators in general, maybe from being caught up in the sort of innovations of the day and getting into sort of focus on the innovations that are actually going to help us to reach our goals and the goals that students might have when we get to work with. So I think with that, we can turn it over to Anna, or if there are questions or anything, we'd love to chat more about any of this.
Yeah, let's feel free. We'll open up to questions in the chat, and I know that there's many of us in the room we're with this. If you also want to just join us with a question, we'd love to hear it.
I have a question that I thought of when you were sharing pictures of students actually physically working on these projects. And I was wondering if there was something perhaps you discovered during that process where students were actually physically in that environment, building an environment that they were going to be in long term. What was that? What was that like? What was sort of like some of perhaps the conversations or reactions students may have had in those moments, and perhaps maybe even contrasting that with previous innovations you may have implemented where students were not involved, and kind of curious about that process.
Yeah,
I'll just jump in real quick and say part of it's like students are in the moment often. So like where I may like for example, say you're creating a mural, is to creating a mural, and we've had some murals made in our school. And when I'm looking at the kids, I'm like, wow, you're leaving your legacy behind. Like, oh, amazing. And they're like, no, Reed, we're just getting out of class. You know, like so it's some of that that happens, but uh, but also they feel there's this connection of we're doing something that has a higher purpose than just
yeah.
um, traditional learning as such.
And I would just add, I think the students who were involved in the actual, like, I mean, they stayed after school one day. I think they like ordered some pizza in, and built all this IKEA furniture. Those students who were there who like I mean, they volunteered to be. They I think had a sense of ownership over that space. I think a bunch of those students who were the ones who were there were ones who um, were more likely to come visit the space once it sort of opened as a literacy lab. And I think also some of them became some of that first group of student tutors. Um, and in the school's second year, when the literacy lab moved into its own room, there's a little bit of like a mentoring kind of thing where like because it started with just a ninth grade class, and then they moved up to 10th grade and a new ninth grade class came in. There's a little bit of like I don't know, like sort of taking students in and being like, this is the like literacy, I helped build this place, and like, oh, if you want to do that, here's how you do it, or like here's a good time to use it, or something like that. So I think there's a kind of ownership that we noticed over time, and yeah, I would hope that a version of that has persisted somehow. It's been a few years since I've been there, but
Robbie, did you want to ask a
Somebody got their hand
question? Oops, where'd he go? I saw Robbie's hand go up. Let's see. Oh, sorry. Robbie, did you have a question? Oh, no, you're okay. All right.
As I've been kind of sitting here listening and Raj's question, how do you sustain that? I mean, that first group that came in and were innovative and partook in that and created that space, you don't tear that down. What does next class get to do? How do you, and again, this is a question that I always have is how do you continue that innovation, giving the next group of students that ownership? Because that first group takes the ownership. How do you give the next group of students? How do you give the next group and the next and so on and so forth? That's always something I've always been curious about and trying to create and do. So any thoughts?
Yeah, just to hop in real quick, part of it is the mentoring that Phil noted is super important. But then also like for sustainability, it's through partnerships because after Phil and the research team left, we still have the lab, but I mean teachers we're stretched thin, so we can't maintain it at the same level that we had when Phil and the partners were there. So again, part of it's through like you got to do some fundraising and have partners to like it's a human resource and a money play as well. But on the mentoring side, the students you have to set the students up to mentor each other. Like for example, just case in point, I started this new position. I call it in my classroom and in my hustle. I call them the FinTern, my financial hustle intern. And so they're learning about business and life and goal setting and finances. And I give them a stipend through grant funding and the like. But like now my current intern, she's a senior, she's about to graduate. I'm like, Renee, we gotta get another intern because we gotta get some more interns in because you're leaving. She's like, oh, nobody can replace you. I'm like, no, you have to be replaced. So you have to go in with the concept of like you have to replace the amazing folks that you develop. And that's how you sustain it.
Yeah.
Knowing it, going in the beginning, I'm going to, and even telling the young folks like you're going to find somebody to replace you and train them or support them in the life.
Yeah, I would agree, and just a second, the mentoring point. I think one piece of that was for that space in particular. At least for those first few years, it was also like being willing to sort of let that evolve as new people sort of inhabited that space, right? And so um, the the first year there was sort of one vision for it, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, but yeah, in subsequent years it became there were sort of different needs, and so like letting that space kind of take on those needs and sort of adapt physically to accommodate them. I think some of those things like allowed different people to have different kind of like attachments to that space and different kinds of connections to that space. And so if it doesn't necessarily look the same. Like sustainability doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't change. um,
Yes.
but
I'm gonna just hop in
yeah,
real quick. So like during the pandemic, you heard a lot about pivoting. Like we were pivoting way before the pandemic. Like that, we were pivoting so much our heads would spin sometimes. Like Phil and I talked about. Sometimes it's messy, y'all. It can get really messy, but when it's from the ground up, it's authentic. It's it, it's essential. That's all. That's what I can say.
yeah, I think that's right.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. I'm just looking at the time. Don't want to take up all your evening. Yes, thank you for joining us, having us think deeply about innovation. Um, think deeply about the values and the definitions that that are often unsaid, and then thinking about the power of whose definitions and whose values then get pushed out. We can see it in so many facets in schools in terms of those power structures. And so thank you for helping us think through that in a very deep and systematic and historical sense of that. Because it's so easy to get caught up in today, and even thinking futures, but thinking histories, you see those echoes, and then it's visceral, like you're talking, Sam, like we have lived it, people have lived it, others, that it's yeah, it's really important for us to think in that, around that topic. So thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, we will see you soon, Sam, or Reed, I should say, across the spaces on Medium. We're reading you, and Bill, and in your work as well. So thank you, both of you.